to my Jewish Learnings Daf Yomi Week in Review. My name is Ben Harris, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to go over what we studied for the last 7 days in our journey through the Daf Yomi cycle together. Our presenter this morning, I'm sure many of you know, Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, is a regular contributor to our series, and he will be guiding our review this morning. Rabbi Goldberg, thanks for being with us.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I am plopping into the chat a link to today's slides. If you wish to watch, I'm going to share them on my screen, but if you wish to watch them on your own, that is, pull them up on your own, you're welcome to do that. Oh, and I have stable Wi-Fi. I'm noticing, I was in a meeting the other day with unstable Wi-Fi. I put that in my name and it's still there. My Wi-Fi is stable today. So if you were worried about me or my Wi-Fi, it's okay. I'll update that later. We'll go straight to the Talmud this week. This is my first time with you guys since we started Baba Batra, the end of the Babas, as they're sometimes referred to. It'll be with us till December. And this week, we got a nice dose of Agadah. And today's theme that we're going to look at is about the writing of Torah. And we're going to look at the writing of Torah in two different ways. One about writing like what the scribes do, and one writing of Torah in terms of authorship. And we'll see what the rabbis have to say about both. And hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up the text. Here we go. And we'll be off and running. And I see a number of you already in the slides here. Okay, here goes the slideshow. So on 14a, we see a braita that where the rabbis teach a Torah scroll should not be made in such a manner that its length, in this case it means height, even though it uses the word length, is greater than its circumference when it's rolled up, nor should its circumference be greater than its length. So let's think about that for a minute, right? The Talmud, well, it uses the word for length based on the fact that it says the length and the circumference of a rolled Torah should be the same. It's not talking about the length like from the beginning of Breshit to the end of Deuteronomy, but it's talking about when you look at the Torah page from the top to the bottom. So what we would call height, even though it uses a word for length. And what the rabbis say is that distance from the top of the parchment to the bottom of the parchment, if you were to measure that, that should be the same distance as the same length as the circumference of a rolled up Torah. So if you picture a Torah with the Torah has a belt, right? When we roll up the Torah, there's a tie or a belt around it. And if you think about the size of the belt that holds the Torah closed when it's closed, that same size of that belt, assuming it's just the circumference and there's not extra length to the belt, if you were to open up the belt and lay it across the Torah, according to this teaching, right, that belt should be the same length as the height of a Torah from start to finish. I love how the rabbis in this text think about that there should be a certain, things should line up, that the circumference of a rolled up Torah and its height should be the same length. There's some, it's not exactly literally symmetry, but I feel like there's a symmetry to that like it's that these two distances are the same. Yet at the same time, it seems to me this is a tough thing to achieve, right? The Torah, you could pick when you're starting to write a Torah, if you're a scribe, what height the Torah should be, what size parchment you're going to use. But it takes a long time to write out the Torah, and it takes a long, and even though there's sort of some set templates for how many, which words go on, how many words, how many sentences go on each page, I would have to imagine, if I were starting to write a Torah and starting on the first page of parchment, I'd sort of be nervous that, like, what if a year later when I'm done, it doesn't line up, right? When we make all the pages and sew them all together, how can I be sure after months and months of labor, that actually the circumference of the Torah, when it's rolled up, will match the height that I chose at the beginning. It might make me a little bit nervous, but I'm not a scribe, so I guess in my life I don't really have to deal with that. But we do have some stories from the rabbis about how it turned out. So the Gemara says, in response to this, Breita tells us two stories. First, it says Rav Huna wrote 70 Torah scrolls himself, and it happened for him that only once the length and the circumference were equal. So Rav Huna's experience is what my fear would be. Rav Huna, it seems, was a scribe according to this tradition. During his lifetime, I imagine, they say he wrote 70 Torah scrolls by himself. Since it does take about a year to write a Torah scroll, that seems like a large quantity. But 70, we know, both in the Bible and for the rabbis, is a round number, right? 70 works like a dozen for us, which is sometimes like it's an approximation. If it's a lot, you might say 70 as opposed to meaning 70 specifically. But the Talmud says Rav Huna wrote 70 Torah scrolls, and only one time did it turn out that the circumference and the height matched for him. So the teaching that before might be aspirational, but Rav Huna wrote a lot of Torahs, was known for that. It didn't come out perfectly for him all the time. The Talmud doesn't say this, but my assumption is that they still use those Torahs, even though the measurements might have been a little off. Now we have a story about the opposite experience. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov wrote one Torah scroll on calf hide. So Rav Acha, not 70, he just wrote one, and it happened to have the same length and circumference, says the Talmud. I like the phrase that says, and it happened to, if that's the goal, he's trying to do it. But Rav Huna got 70, was 1 for 70. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov was 1 for 1, right? He's batting 1,000. He wrote one Torah. I don't know. And it came out perfectly. But according to the story, it didn't end well for him. The sages looked at him and his achievement with jealousy. The rest of the rabbis said, "Oh, that's not fair. Right? Rav Huna did it 70 times and only worked out perfectly once. You did perfectly on your first Torah." And it says, as a result of their jealousy, they were jealous, and he, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, died from their envious gaze. So the death of a Talmudic rabbi isn't something to chuckle at, but sometimes I do chuckle at these stories. We have a number of stories in the Talmud where one rabbi gets angry at another and stares him down. And the power of the rabbinic gaze is that in the stories it can cause the end of your life. The reason why I chuckle at it some, I sort of feel like it feels a little funny that like they were jealous and so they stared at him and then like that was it. That was his end. But I also think it's not really meant to be taken literally. I think like that he, in his perfect Torah scroll on his first try, got them to be jealous and maybe he got their wrath. And I think this is more a metaphor than literal, meaning their stare, caused his end. Although when we were in rabbinical school, we couldn't wait to take the class where we learned the gaze that could cause people like serious harm. But at least in the 20th century, they weren't teaching that in rabbinical school anymore. So I never learned that skill. It's probably a tool too dangerous, if literal, to be given to anybody. But here we see two different. So anyways, two stories here, both about aspiring to meet the standard set out by the Breita before. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is batting 1,000, but he only did one try. Who would know what happened if he did another 69? Rav Huna 1 for 70. And it shows, I think, here that this aspiration for the Torah to come out right is an aspiration more than legislation. And strikes me that it's a tough task to accomplish. And when you do it, it's something to celebrate. And when you miss, don't think it disqualifies the Torah. I imagine there's a deviation that's way out of whack that might deviate the Torah, but this is an aspiration that they aspire to. All right, so that's theme number one, the actual task of writing Torahs, and one rule and two stories about it. Little later on, oh, sorry, I got one more. I forgot about the third one. Thank God the slide reminded me. Third story, the sages said to Rav Himnuna, Rav Ami wrote 400 Torah scrolls. So if you think 70 could be a lot, 400 seems, 400 also a round number for the Bible, right? We have a lot of 40s in the Bible and 400 is 10 40s. So it means like we might say a gajillion today, which is means a lot, not literally a gajillion, however many zeros that might be. So he wrote 400 Torahs, and Rav Ami, right? The traditions he wrote 400 Torahs, and Rav Amnuna said, "Well, I'm not sure I believe this. Maybe he just wrote the verse, Moses commanded us the Torah, right? Torah tziva lanu Moshe. You might know it's a verse we sing this verse a lot. In Hebrew, it's a song. Sometimes in many synagogues, when we're actually rapping the Torah, we sing Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Sorry, my voice is cracking today, but that was your musical performance for the morning. Rav Amnuna says, well, there's no way he wrote 400 Torahs. Maybe he just helped write 400 Torahs and just wrote this one phrase, right? Moses commanded us the Torah, which represents the Torah as a whole. And he did this verse 400 times in 400 Torahs, and that's how he got to the 400 number. So if we thought 70 was a lot before, 400 seems impossible. I scribes who do a Torah a year, who begin their work as a scribe, I don't know, in their young 20s and work productively to their 70s, might be able to do 50 Torahs in a lifetime. 400 seems unachievable for one particular human. And while the tradition attributes this to Rav Ami, it seems that Rav Huna might have it better, that it wasn't literal, right? So either 400 is an exaggeration, just that Rav Ami wrote a lot of them, or it's that he showed up at the end and wrote one of the last verses, so it could count as if he participated in the writing of 400 Torahs. If you aspire to write a Torah, it's actually a mitzvah to write a Torah, be part of writing a Torah. Many communities sometimes, when they commission a new Torah, have the soferes writing it come, and members of the congregation can help write a letter. I think also Safaria is doing that digitally right now. If you're using Safaria for your study, you might want to look at you can have a digital letter in the digital Torah on Safaria, different kind of mitzvah, but also a nice thing to do. All right, so that's a piece about writing the Torahs. After we talk about writing the Torah, the actual writing of the Torah, the Talmud moves on to talk about actually authorship of the Torah. We in our day think about who wrote the Torah, and the academics have lots to say about it, but that'll be the topic of maybe a different My Jewish Learning session. Today, we're going to look at how the rabbis think about who actually wrote the books of the Bible. And they asked that question on 14b, which we saw this week, and who wrote the books of the Bible, and they give us a list. Want to go through the list and focus on a couple pieces of it. So they say Moses wrote his own book and the portion of Balaam and the book of Job. There's a discussion this week about when the story of Job was meant to take place, and some say, some in the rabbinic community think that Job was a contemporary of Moses, and Moses wrote down the book of Job. We today think Job is a much later book than the books of the Torah, and so this is a very rabbinic statement, not a modern statement. What's interesting here, it says Moses wrote his own book. Not clear specifically what that means. Some commentators say, well, that means he wrote the whole Torah, right? We call the Torah Chamisha Chumshei Torah, right? The 5 volumes of Torah, the 5 books of the Torah that are Moses's. And some think this means Moses wrote his own book, that he wrote down the entire Torah. Other people say Moses wrote his own book. His own book would be Deuteronomy, Devarim at the end, because the book of Deuteronomy, almost all of it is a series of speeches that Moses makes to the Israelites right before they enter the land. And as the Torah is Moses's speeches to the people, recounting their journey since they left Egypt and giving them some charges and repeating some of the laws that they need to know as they enter the land. Some say that this statement here in the Talmud means Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy. And if you're in that second camp, the implication is that right, the rest was written, given by God, and God's the author of the first ones. And if you're in the camp that says Moses wrote his own book, means the whole Torah, the Torah and the rabbis have plenty of midrashim, which we've seen sprinkled throughout the Talmud, about God dictating the Torah to Moses and him being the scribe, not the writer. But the book of Devarim is Moses' words and his speeches, so he's thought of as the writer of that. A curious piece here. It's coming up next week's, not this week, next week's Parshat Shavua, the weekly portion. It says Moses wrote the portion of Balaam. It's interesting that it singles out, right? Balaam was a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet commissioned by Balak, the king, to go and curse the Jewish people, and he ends up blessing the Jewish people. It's found in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. So if you're in the camp that says Moses wrote the whole Torah, Balaam, portion of Balaam is a part of it, and it's harder to explain what it's doing here. If you think Moses wrote just the fifth book, this little phrase adds something, right? Moses wrote the portion of Balaam. Why do we say that? Well, the chapter, the story of Balaam is where a non-Jewish prophet sent by a non-Jewish king to curse the people ends up blessing the people. And Balaam in rabbinic literature especially is seen as, the rabbis don't see him favorably because he was out to curse the Israelites, even though he didn't at the end. And this shows the rabbis' discomfort a little bit with the fact that you might want to say Balaam wrote the prophecies that he gave, and they're in the Torah. How could it be that Balaam, a non-Jewish prophet, is the writer, the author of some of the Torah? Well, it's not Balaam who wrote all that down. The story of Balaam and that portion was written by Moses, not Balaam, the other prophet. And here, the rabbis and the Talmud want us to know, right? Don't worry, Balaam's in the story, and his prophecy is written there, but those words weren't written by him. Moses recorded them down to include them in the story. You should file that away and think about it when you look at next week's Parshat Shavua. All right, moving on with the list. Joshua wrote his own book, the book of Joshua, and 8 verses in the Torah. I'm going to come back to the 8 verses of the Torah after we finish the list. Samuel wrote his own book, the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth in our Bible today appears in the writings, not in the prophets, much later, where it just shows up in the library, but it happens in the time of the Judges, says the first verse of the book of Ruth. And the rabbis attribute its authorship to Samuel, like the book of Judges. Next slide. David wrote the book of Psalms by means of 10 elders, and then we have a list of who they are. The Psalms are attributed to David. Many of the Psalms, if you read the book of Psalms, say at the beginning, a Psalm of David. So the biblical book actually ascribes its authorship of many of its parts to David, but there are also other Psalms that have attributions at the beginning about who wrote them, and the rabbis list them here for us in the Talmud, and says David collected Psalms written by others and added some of his own. Some are anonymous in the book of Psalms, but according to the rabbis, David is the compiler and the author, so editor and contributing editor of the book of Psalms. Quickly, we'll go through the books at the end. Jeremiah, the Talmud ends, wrote his own book. You'll see it's interesting of the prophets who presented their prophecies. Jeremiah is the only one that the rabbis say wrote his own book. Also, the 2 books of Kings and the book of Lamentations, right? Jeremiah is a prophet of the destruction of the temple. Lamentations, the book of Echa, which we read on Tisha B'Av, a little more than a month from now. Poetry in response to the destruction of the temple. The rabbis attribute to Jeremiah, and some of his prophecies echo some of the themes of Lamentations. Hezekiah, a king of Israel, and his colleagues. So he and his colleagues, it's not clear if that means other kings before him or the members of his court. They were the people who wrote Isaiah. So Isaiah, while we have his prophecies, unlike Jeremiah, someone else recorded his words. Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. What's interesting about some of that Proverbs and Song of Songs are often attributed to Solomon by the rabbis, but not in this text today. And in fact, Song of Songs starts with, right, Shir Hashirim Asher L'Shlomo, right, the Song of Songs from Solomon. But today's text says Hezekiah the king was the writer of this book. The members of the Great Assembly, post-biblical, pre-rabbinic, in the rabbinic narratives, they're the ones who recorded the words of the prophet Ezekiel and the other 12 prophets, the book of Daniel, and the scroll of Esther. So in this rabbinic telling, these works are all recorded, put into words later than the previous ones. And Ezra, who's a contemporary of the original Great Assembly, wrote his own book, the Book of Ezra, and the genealogy section that appears in the group of Chronicles until his time. The genealogy there might push a little forward, so Ezra couldn't write the genealogy beyond him. Right? He was a leader, didn't have the prophetic nature. What's interesting here from the list is the book of Nehemiah. It doesn't appear on the list. He might have written his own, but we have an initial take on here a whole series of books and who the rabbis think wrote them. I think it's interesting to see that this take of it. It's an ancient question that continued into the modern period. Who wrote the Torah? Where did it come from? If you want a more modern take, I recommend to you the book Who Wrote the Torah, Richard Elliot Friedman, a really accessible introduction to contemporary scholarship and how we think about the authorship of the Torah. And his middle name is Elliot, so I like recommending his books just because of that connection. Anyways, that's a little tangent. Probably could have skipped that one. I want to go back to what we saw at the beginning that it said Joshua wrote his own book and 8 verses in the Torah. So unlike what I said before about the portion of Balaam, right? We were concerned that maybe a non-Jewish prophet wrote some of the Torah. So the rabbis are clear to point out that Moses actually wrote down those sections. But now we see Joshua wrote his own book and 8 verses of the Torah. So the line about Moses wrote his own book, whether it's the Torah or Deuteronomy, they sort of mean his whole book except for 8 verses, because Joshua wrote 8 of the verses, say the rabbis. I'm going to skip down. And there are a couple versions about which 8. I'm going to just stick to based on the time we have, we're going to look at one of the traditions about that. We'll see how it goes if we can squeeze in the other. So I have on the screen for you the last 8 verses of the Torah. And these are the verses that tradition says Moses didn't write, Joshua wrote. And if you look at these verses, they start with Deuteronomy 34, verse 5, saying, God buried him, and the him here is Moses, in the valley of the land of Moab, near Beth Peor. No one knows where his burial place to this day. Talks about how old Moses was when he died, how the Israelites mourned for him, and they wailed through a mourning period till it was over, and then Yoshua took over, and never again was there a prophet like Moses, and Yoshua led them into when Yoshua was going to take the leadership and move forward. There was never a leader like Moses before. And the rabbis ascribe these verses to Joshua for 2 reasons. One is sort of a literal reason, that if the Torah and the end of the Torah was being written in real time, it says in verse 5 that God buried Moses in the land of Moab, and no one was with him, so Moses was alone. If Moses wrote the last verses of the Torah, we wouldn't have them because he was alone with God. Or if Moses sort of if God pre-wrote these verses with Moses before he died, the rabbis read this to say it sort of lacks a certain kindness or sensitivity. Right, the end of the Torah, our Torah, unfortunately, in some ways is a tragedy. Moses, the leader of the people, dies before seeing the fulfillment of the vision. He doesn't get to go to the land. This week's Parsha has some, Korach has some things, Chukat has some things about that. Maybe you'll talk about that if you come to the Parsha class tomorrow. But there's a sense that if God were to have told Moses about his end, and this verse about that, the fact of making Moses write the verse about his own death and burial would be unkind, not pastoral, not the way that the end would be. The rabbis envision that the story, Moses' part of writing in the story went up to this part and the recording of Moses' death, and the last words describing Moses and his leadership. That task was given to Joshua. So Moses, who already suffered the disappointment of not getting to go into the land, didn't have to go through the painful process of writing about his own death in the Torah. And I guess I'll just add I'll take one more minute for this. The other rabbinic tradition about which are the 8 verses are the first 8 verses of the last chapter of the Torah. So the last 4 of these overlap. But on that theme of God didn't want to make Moses write about his own death, if you look at the first 8 verses of the last chapter, it begins when Moses climbs up the mountain to be with God, and God shows him the land, and then Moses dies. And those who say the reason why Joshua wrote 8 of the verses was to protect Moses from having to write them himself because of the just some kindness and compassion at the end of his life. Some feel it should be these 8 verses that Moses actually got the last verses from 9 to 12 in this chapter, which talk about how great of a leader he was. But the whole episode of him climbing the mountain and dying with God was left for Joshua to record moving forward. So that's a little bit about the actual writing of the Torah and who wrote the Torah, and this midrash about the end of the writing of the end of the Torah and Moses's experience for that. I know for me personally, when we get to the end of the Torah, which isn't so many few weeks away, I find it to be really sad, and it's that Moses doesn't get into the land. We're going to read this week the story of Moses hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, which is where God in the Torah gives Moses the decree he won't get into the land. As we're about to start the repentance season, I'm a deep believer that God believes in repentance and forgiveness. I'm holding out hope. I'm a Cubs fan too, so I know about holding out hope. I believe deeply this year God's going to forgive Moses, and Moses is going to reach the promised land. Most years I'm disappointed, but I'm still holding out hope that this is the year God forgives Moses. Moses enters the land, lets Joshua leads the people, but he should just get, a nice house in the Galilee to sit and end his days and enjoy the bounty of the land and all his work. And who knows, maybe the Torah will end differently this year. I read it every year with that hope, and we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's a little bit from this week of Daf Yomi. Of course, there was so much more. It was a really rich week. I see while I was chatting, we got about 30 comments in the chat, too many for me to follow. I think we might have time for a question or two if the first one is fast, or I don't know if, I don't know, Ben, if you were watching the chat and could call out a question that was there that we should address. If not, I'm happy to take one from the crowd. Somebody always has.
There are a couple in there. Let me see if I can grab one real quick.
All right, that's fine. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Um, but I also see Joe raising his hand. Maybe
Let's do that.
let's invite Joel to hang out 1 second. Joel, can you unmute yourself?
Rabbi, thank you. Do you hear me?
We
can
do.
hear you.
Yes, Rabbi. I think it's very, very interesting, your presentation, but my belief is that God wrote the Torah and all these books, but he might have used these people as agents, but ultimately it's about God.
I really appreciate that comment. God is certainly like the main character of the Bible as a whole, right? God appears in all the books, and it's certainly a traditional Jewish belief that God is the writer of the Torah. And right, if you look at the prophetic prophets, they introduce many of their prophecies by saying, the word of God came to me and here I'm going to share it. So even the prophets who are speaking with their own mouth to the people, right, attribute many of their words to God. But it's interesting, Joel, I'll say here, the notion that some of the books of the Bible were written by people goes back here to Talmudic times. We see it, right, back to the if some of these texts were Tannaitic, so first, second century, meaning that if you look at the histories in the book of Joshua, Judges, Kings, those books sometimes reference scribes whose job it was to record things, and the rabbis envisioned that some of the characters of those books were the ones who recorded the histories in those sections. Of course, the topic of who wrote the Torah on a theological level is a big one. We don't have minutes for that today, and there's a range of beliefs in the diverse Jewish world today, from God is the author of the Torah and maybe beyond, to the other side of the spectrum that says our sacred texts are are created by humans in response to God. There's a whole range of perspectives there, and I know there's a lot in the My Jewish Learning written library to read about all the different perspectives and where they come from, and maybe we'll have another opportunity to dig deeper into who wrote the books of the Torah and what the different views are and what the implications are that. But Joel, thank you for raising that. I really appreciate that, and I think we're out of minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Goldberg. Thanks, Joel. Thanks for everyone for being here. And we will be back next week. Look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.